Good afternoon, everyone. This is Ju Chen. I'm a professor of finance and among other things at the University of Hong Kong. So welcome to this session of the Quantitative History Webinar series. So today, we're very pleased to have Professor Christopher Paik, who is an associate professor of political science at the New York University, Abu Dhabi. So he is an expert on political geography, political economy, and economic history. He's interested in the role of geography in explaining long-term outcomes related to political and economic development, the origins of the state and the state stability, as well as the causes and effects of historical global encounters, including colonialism and the politics of ethnic identification. So today he's going to share with us his recent research on reform, rails and rice, political railroads, and local development in Thailand. So just as for the format of today's webinar, let me remind everyone again, we have a 1-hour presentation first by Professor Paik, to be followed by a discussion by my colleague, a new colleague at the University of Hong Kong, Professor Do Kim. His home university is Yongji University in Korea. Starting a week ago, he has been visiting the University of Hong Kong with us. So he's an expert on economic history as well as general economics. So he will share his thoughts and discussion with us for about 15 to 20 minutes. And then after that, my colleague, Professor Zhichen Ma, will take it on to manage the Q&A from all of you. So during the presentation, as well as during the discussion, if you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the Q&A box so that Professor Ma will select from your questions and read on your behalf for Professor Paik to respond and comment on. Okay, so without further ado, Professor Paik.
Thank you, Professor Chen, and also Professor Ma for this kind invite. It's wonderful to be part of this initiative, Quantitative History, which I consider to be very much a core field of my research. We're joined today by my co-author as well, Jessica Wik-Bang-Yong-Nat, from the Faculty of Economics at Chulalongkorn University. So if I can't answer some of your questions during Q&A, I'm sure she'll be able to answer them for us. So today, we're presenting a working paper. It's called Reform, Rails and Rice, Thailand's Political Railroads and Economic Development in the 20th Century. This project was motivated by the following research question. How do external threats on state sovereignty benefit local
do you mind sharing your PPT?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Did I not share it with you? Hold on. Does that work? Beth, can you see it?
Not yet.
Not yet. Let's share. About now.
Yeah, it works now.
Does it work now?
Yeah.
Thank you. It
Okay,
works.
great. Okay, so again, the question that was driving this research is the following: how do external threats on state sovereignty benefit local development? In particular, we're going to look at the impact of Siam, which is the old name for Thailand, Siam's colonial period political railroads on urbanization and agricultural development in the 20th century Thailand. Okay, so to give you a bit of background on related literature, we know that there's been a set of economic history works that try to quantify the impact of transportation infrastructure projects on subsequent various economic and social outcomes. Most of these works are looking at railroad construction in particular, directly implemented by the colonizers. So in that regard, our focus is slightly different because we're looking at the internal reform implemented by Siam itself under the threat of Western colonization. So the railroad construction was carried forth by the king himself and not by colonizers in Siam. Okay, in terms of the literature on transportation in Thailand, perhaps the most authoritative source that we reference heavily in our paper is from Kakizaki. So he looks at the economic impact of rail infrastructure in Thailand. Jessica also has a forthcoming article in JVH that looks at the impact of canal infrastructure. And she looks at the case of Bangkok, the city itself, and how canal expansion influences or has an impact on orchard cultivation in the city. Finally, this paper I'm presenting you today is an extension of Jessica and my previous publication in 2019 in World Politics. We're looking at a more general mechanism. So there we see how colonial threat in Siam leads to selective centralization that led to diverging development outcomes throughout the kingdom. In this paper, rather than looking at the mechanisms broadly, we look at a specific channel through which the colonial pressure led to long-run and uneven economic outcomes across Thailand. In the case of, and we're looking at the railways. So the railways were constructed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And we're going to be looking at not the provincial outcomes that we looked at before, but more specifically the disaggregated district level outcomes in northern and northeastern Thailand. Now, allow me to give you a brief historical political context of Siam and what was going on at the turn of the century. So Siam's traditional governance system is a former Southeast Asian mandala system. So mandala literally translates to core periphery. So manda means core, la means the periphery. And this is a concept that's driven or derived from Buddhist tradition. So maybe some of you have seen Tibetan Thangka paintings, and there you have the Buddha in the center, and then you have the emanating circle of influence from the central figure. So it's kind of akin to that system where you have the central polity with a tributary surrounding the polity, giving tributes. Yeah? So the boundaries based on social hierarchy and tribute that were prevalent in Southeast Asia, this was very different from a Western concept of geographic space and boundaries. The usual notion that we have of territorial borders and territorial states is a bit of a conception that is coming from the Western tradition. So we didn't have territorial states in Southeast Asia. Rather, the boundaries were loosely defined by the tributary relationship between the central and peripheral polities. So in the same tradition, in Thailand or Siam, provinces were classified based on the strength of relationship with Bangkok and was closely related to their geographic proximity to the capital city. So we have core inner provinces classified as class 4, that was under the direct control of Bangkok. And then you have inner provinces, still strong central control by Bangkok. Then you have the external provinces and tributary states that are much farther away from Bangkok than the core and inner provinces. So you can see how the kingdom was loosely defined under such political structure, with Bangkok in the middle. And then you have this kind of emanating circle of influence, if you will, from the core towards the peripheries. Okay. And this was the state of Siam in 1892, prior to the massive political reform in the kingdom. Okay. So I think many of you probably know that Thailand was never colonized, and this is the source of fierce pride among Thais that I've encountered. But at the same time, there was a real need for government reform, especially under the encroachment of Western powers, especially in particular by the British and the French in the second half of the 19th century. The fact that there was no direct control by Bangkok over the peripheries and the absence of geographical borders meant that this increasing encroachment upon the formerly claimed lands under Siam, a lot of them were at the risk of annexation by the French and the British. In fact, Siam lost about half the territory under its influence to the French and the British at the turn of the century. And you can see that on this map. Progressively, you see the outer areas of formerly Siam territories being occupied by the Western powers. Okay, so in response to this encroachment, what King Chulalongkorn carries out is a series of centralization efforts. So he takes the initiative of creating what is called Monton. So this is the administrative circles, the new second level administrative unit, with representation from the central state or central government in Bangkok that clearly demarcated geographical boundaries of both provinces and Monton. And this initiative to create clearly delineated geographical administrative units was carried out over the course of about 2 decades between 1893 and 1915. The location and local autonomy jointly determine the order of integration. And what we find in our 2019 article is that the areas that were under the most direct threat of colonization also happened to become part of the centralization the fastest or the earliest. This was an effort by King Chulalongkorn to make sure that his centralization effort will be reaching those areas that were under the most risk of becoming colonized by the French and British. So here we show the timing of Monton establishment, right? So you can see that in the immediate kind of locales, you see faster Monton establishment, but also certain areas that were under the most threat of being encroached upon, they were centralized pretty fast too. Okay, so how does centralization and economic development relate to each other? We know that in other geographic contexts, a lot of these studies from the existing literature really look at, let's say, European city-state formation. In our case, kind of similar logic carries through, which is when you have an external threat, it imposes or incentivizes the rulers to start centralizing, increasing their fiscal and state capacity, and in turn, they invest into public goods, namely defense, but also other public goods that will be conducive for development. Now, one thing that faced Siam King Chulalongkorn was fiscal constraint. So the government revenue was not overflowing. There was certainly innovation in tax collection. So there was an effort to directly tax citizens, and collection efforts were made so that there was an increase in state revenue. But Siam continued to suffer from disadvantaged trade relations or trade sanctions, namely 1855 Borrowing Treaty. There's also very little borrowing from abroad. So credit and debit market, utilizing that was something that the king would not go for because he was afraid that that would invite a lot of colonial influence in his decisions. So there was little borrowing from abroad. There was limited revenue from trade. Centralization helped with tax collection, but not to a large extent or not enough, which meant that there was very limited government resources that could be channeled into infrastructure buildup. So the king really had to make a decision on where to centralize early on. So again, from our previous work, what we find is that the ones that had this initial injection of government effort to centralize, the early Montons, they enjoyed higher levels of public goods provision and railway investments. But once the government ran out of funding, there was really nothing that could have been done up until 1960s and 70s. So you can see that for a pretty long period of time, after that initial injection of public goods provision, there wasn't much provided by the state. Okay, let me talk to you about the railway developments. Now in the 1880s, the French and the British both proposed railways through Siam's external provinces and tributary states. This was, of course, an effort for them to expand their influence and territorial claim into Siam. Siam government summarily refused this request, and they decided to build railways by themselves. So Siam commenced construction on 3 strategic rail lines. We're going to be looking at northeast and north in particular. These political railroads were chosen based on strategic concerns and not economic viability. So to give you an example, the routes went out far enough to facilitate Bangkok's consolidation of power, but not far enough for the rail to be potentially overtaken or used by the French or the British. The first rail line to northeast ended in Korat near French holdings in order to manage unrest in the upper northeast. The route also avoided Tak. This was an important town for British teak trade and went through Pichai instead, which is another important junction, in the sense that it managed the unrest due to centralization in the north and northeast. So I'll show you, we have a map of these strategic centers that I'll be able to show you later on. What the railway construction and infrastructure did was drastically reduced the number of days it would have taken to travel from Bangkok to these peripheral regions. So you can see on the right panel, in the case of northern and northeastern towns, the travel times was much reduced during the dry season. And of course, during the wet season, traditionally people would not have been able to travel up north because everywhere it was flooded. In the dry season, it still would have taken a long time for them to get to the peripheral areas. But with the arrival of the railways, that travel time was drastically cut down. What is the importance of the railways for achieving centralization? Here are several quotes that we obtained from the king himself and also from Graham. So King Chulalongkorn says, by bringing the different parts of a country within close communication, the railway renders possible that close and beneficial supervision, which is necessary to effective administration. Also, for purpose of administration, the value of the railways cannot be overrated, and in fact, the present system of rural government could hardly exist without them. And finally, areas that did not have railway infrastructure and remained difficult to reach both physically and administratively received nothing at all in the way of social, economic, or administrative benefit from the state. So again, in this paper, we, for these reasons, we're focusing on the railway as a critical instrument of Siam's centralization effort. Okay, so Siam had limited government revenues, and in some ways, using that revenue to build railways was not the most economically viable option. That's why we call them political railways, because the purpose of building this railway infrastructure was not based on economic gains. Using Siam's limited government revenue instead to expand the irrigation system or water management during this time period would have been more beneficial. to Siam's economy. And this is according to several scholars. But at the same time, Kakizaki, the authoritative source on Thailand's railway during this time, he argues that the railways were also economically beneficial in its own terms, as it increased intra-regional trade. There was also rice market integration, price conversions, and as you might expect, the railways were the vehicle for overall economic development in these once peripheral regions. So we're going to empirically document this and show you the results. The amount of rail tonnage that went back and forth, north and northeastern lines, steadily increased over time. The reason we're missing data points from 1925 to, let's say, 1933, the standards of record keeping were different during this time, so it's not really comparable from the previous years. But you can see that there was an overall increase. There was a slight dip, well, I guess it's pretty drastic reduction in the carriage amount. This was due to World War II. But you can see that the transportation means really did improve the rice and other agricultural products being carried forth in the country. Okay, let me move on to data methodology. Now, we have three main outcomes. We look at district level population, district area under rice cultivation. So rice would have been the main output for international trade. And then we have district area under gardening crop cultivation. So gardening crops would have been kind of good proxy for goods that were traded at the intra-regional level. Okay. We source our data from the following: 1947 census, 1966, and 1941. The outcome variables at the district level, to our understanding, have not been utilized before in other Thai studies. And Jessica can later fill you in on the amount of work that was entailed in order to transcribe, look for the source, identify the sources first, but also transcribe by hand the records. So it was a bit of a massive undertaking. So that's one of the contributions on this project. The outcome again, there is population, rice area planted, and area planted in garden crops. These are the three outcomes that we're looking at, and it be a function of the distance to the nearest rail as of 1941. We look at 1941 as the cutoff period. This was the end year under which the colonial plan for rail lines kind of ended, and this was shortly before World War II. So we look at the railway expansion between the end of 1800s all the way to 1941. So that's our main variable interest, distance to the nearest rail lines. We also include a battery of district level geographic controls. Provincial fixed effects and standard errors are adjusted for spatial correlation. And we also implement an instrumental variable strategy in which the distance to the nearest rail line is instrumented by distance to straight lines connecting strategically important cities. This seems to be a pretty standard IB approach. Happy to talk more about this if anyone has questions. And here are the summary stats. So we have district level population, rice, garden vegetables planted, distance to nearest railway, the IB instrument, then different ways of measuring the distance to the nearest rail. So this could be foot travel, and others. So we're going to show you alternative specification results. Yeah, okay. So the baseline results are the following. We see that the outcome variables, the population density is negatively correlated with distance to nearest rail. The same thing goes for rice paddies and garden crops. right? So just substantively, if you have to interpret this result, a 10-kilometer distance away, or additional 10-kilometer distance away from the nearest rail leads to about 7% decrease in population density, 9% decrease in proportion of land that's cultivated for rice, and 14% decrease. This is not terribly surprising because you'd expect that access to major transportation network would likely have positive impact on local development. And that's exactly what we see in terms of population density, rice cultivation, again, mainly for interregional or international trade, and also garden crops that were mainly catering the market, intra-regional market. This is the IV regression. So you can see that first stage regression is under column 4, highly significant. And the coefficient changes are very, very small. So we can see that all the results pretty much are identical to the previous set of results. And then as alternative specification, we're also looking at not only distance to the nearest rail, but how long it might take for a person to travel by foot to the nearest rail. So this is 1 to 2 days travel, more than 2 days travel. And the results are pretty consistent. Again, if you're farther away from the railway access, then your local development goes down. Another specification that we're interested in is the number of years within 1 day of nearest rail. That's a bit confusing. So what this means is throughout the expansion of railways, we know that certain railways were laid in the beginning, some of them came later. So for each district, we identified the earliest railway that was laid in that particular district, and then counted the number of years, right? So this is a number of years of, if you will, exposure to railway access for a given region. And that's also pretty significant and positive. So the longer access that you had throughout the course of decades, the more likely you see local development rising. And then we also carried out a placebo test. So here, there are 2 railways that were proposed but never completed. There's one up in northwest, Chiang-Saen Planned Railway here, if you can see that. And then there's also Paik Planned Railway. So these 2 railways were proposed but never completed. So then the concern is, are we really capturing railway effect or a certain set of surroundings that were kind of conducive for building railways? And it's that set of conditions that are driving the development outcomes and not the railways themselves. So when you carry out these placebo tests, we see that the proposed lines have very marginal, insignificant effect or impact on development outcomes, whereas the distance to the nearest railroad that was actually built, this continues to have a pretty strong correlation. You see that this is positive, but the direction of the coefficient is actually in the opposite direction. So we're not very concerned about this particular result under our placebo test. Okay, and then what happened after 1947? So our baseline results are looking at 1947, but of course, a lot of things have changed in Siam after 1947 with the end of World War II. There was very little railway construction that followed. Instead, we have a series of initiatives building road and highway across different provinces and regions, and a lot of them kind of opened up. So you have Thailand finally opening up to 4 and 8, which made it possible to build these road infrastructure with the rise of automobiles. The kind of subsequent inquiry that we had in mind was how persistent is the railway effect on local development in Thailand after World War II. So we were able to get similar set of outcomes for 1966. Right, so almost 2 decades. Yeah, 2 decades after 1947. Do we see any changes? And what we see is that distance to nearest railways, although its magnitude, the impact of the magnitude does decrease quite a bit from the previous results. The negative coefficient still remains statistically significant, and it holds quite steady and strong. And that goes the same for placebo test as well. And the ID results. Now, I think I'm going to end pretty early, but there's yet another set of empirical exercise that we undertook. This is market access counterfactual. What we were interested in, again, was the competing infrastructure project that could have been chosen instead of railways. So we asked, how does the economic outcome of the railways compare against the effect of counterfactual spending on other types of investment? And this other type of investment is going to be water management. That appeared to be much more economically viable option with better set of development outcomes than political railways. So we assessed the impact of rails on market access compared to an alternative investment in water management and irrigation in the Central Plain. Now, the water management plan was something that was proposed by Van der Heide. And because Siam was facing pretty severe fiscal constraints, they had to make a decision. So Van der Heide, who was a water engineer and advisor to the Siamese government, proposes a comprehensive water management project for the Central Plains in 1903, arguing that when you developed water management and expansion of canals, it would have increased petty output, boost the export economy, create more pathways or networks through canals. At the same time, the expense was comparable to building the railways. So there's a real kind of, wait, I think there's a Q&A. Oh, okay. Xiaopeng, allow me to answer this question in the Q&A. Just hold off on your question. I'll be happy to answer you. Okay, so the expense would have been comparable. So the government had to make a decision between rebuilding the railways and expanding the water management. The government chose to invest in railways for strategic purpose. So what's the outcome? So in order to compare the counterfactual outcome to the actual outcome, we make use of market access approach that was popularized by the seminal paper by Donaldson Hornback. So for this effort, we create complete GIS network database in Thailand and obtain the least cost route between each and every pair of districts. So this is the market access formula that Donaldson Hornback uses, which is a function of district to district trade costs, tau, trade elasticity, as well as the district population. And you can see that it utilizes every pairwise combination of all the districts within Thailand. The intuition here being that overall market access of the overall economy will be dependent on how easy it is for one to travel from one district to another, given many alternative options of travel or transport, right? So in this case, this is just, I'm giving you examples of different networks that we had to create. There are 20 layers in total. There are 10 of them here. Each of these would provide some distance coverage between two districts, right? And then you overlay all these GIS network database files on top of each other to calculate the least cost transport route between every pair of districts. And that forms the basis of this district to district trade cost. And then we calculate DMA. Okay, so what do we find? Market access with railways. Just as an aside, the data captures trade elasticity So in the literature, trade elasticity varies anywhere from 3 to 13. It depends on the context, the content. Unfortunately, for the Thailand case, we don't have trade volume data between each district. So that would be the input data that we would have to have access to in order to calculate the trade elasticity for this formula. We don't have it. So instead, we set data is equal to 1, but we also look at the results and how the results change depending on various bodies of data. And we set it from 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way to 13. And the results are, for most part, pretty similar. Substantively, very little difference. So we're going to set data is equal to 1. And what you see here is, again, for our 3 different outcome variables, market access with railway construction that happened in history. You have districts with higher market access, also enjoying higher population density, higher district or greater amount of land cultivated for rice, and greater amount of land cultivated for garden crops. And this is not necessarily counterintuitive, yeah, because if you have more market access, just means you have more access to greater markets. So this in itself is not terribly surprising. One thing that I think is what is interesting is column 3, where we have positive correlation between market access and garden crops. It's positive, but not statistically significant. So it seems to suggest that when you are talking about market access, and of course, market access will be of paramount importance when you're thinking about inter-regional or international trade. But when it comes to intra-regional trade, this market access that is based on the kind of access points across the entire country, this is not a significant factor when we're looking at intra-regional garden crop variable, but it's still positively correlated. Here we look at market access difference between rails and water management scheme. So how we calculated this was looking at the market access with the proposed canal development as an additional layer. So we have 20 layers. One of them would have been the new canal. So in the scenario where canal and the water management was implemented, we can calculate the market access under that scenario. The baseline scenario is where railways, as historically implemented or developed, we look at the railways as one of the networks, and then we calculate market access. And then you can take the difference between the two. And what you find in the map is the following. If the water management plan had been built instead of the railways, we see that population density on average would have been 30% lower. The proportion of land in rice paddies would have been 39% lower. And the proportion of land in garden crops would have been 25% lower. So based on market access change, it seems that railways had much more productive or influential development outcomes in the north and northeastern region here. And you can see that the market access change is most pronounced. The darkest corners here are the terminus locations of these railways, right? So these peripheral areas that would have access, that had access to the railways, if the railways were taken out, they would have suffered the most due to decreased market access. You can see it on this map. Okay, so now to conclude, we find that northern and northeastern rail lines were built primarily for political purpose. Turns out the districts closer to railways did see positive economic benefits by 1947, and we see some kind of persistent effect of it in 1966 as well. Substantively, compared to a district located directly on the railway, those that were 10 kilometers away in 1947 saw 7% smaller population density, 9% less rice cultivation, 14% less vegetable cultivation. Benefits were localized. likely because of lack of connecting transport routes during this time. And then with the market access approach, we see that without railways and under the water management investment, at least for these two areas, the provinces in the north and northeast, they would have suffered mightily from lack of access. And so the railways, not only were they political, but economic, it would have made economic sense, at least for these two provinces. Right, but having said that, again, the development outcomes were very much localized, and this led to lasting uneven distribution of benefits that we find in this paper, as well as the previous one in 2019 in World Politics. Yeah, I think this actually concludes my presentation. It's a bit shorter than I expected, but I don't think anyone usually complains about short seminars. So I'm happy to take on Dual's thoughts on the paper, and also maybe we'll have longer Q&A session. Thanks for listening.
I think, oh, okay. Thank you, Christopher. For some reason, I cannot turn on my video. So let me turn it to my colleague, Professor Ma. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Christopher. Yeah. So next we will turn to our discussion session. We are very happy to have Professor Do Kim from Muji University to give about 15 to 20 minutes discussion before we turn to the Q&A from the audience. Yeah, yeah, Do.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Chang. Yes, I'm Do Kim, Myungji University, and currently visiting University of Hong Kong. I'm very pleased to have a chance to comment on Christopher's paper. He is also one of my co-authors. Yes, because the paper is a little bit different from today's presentation. That is, the version of the manuscript I received is organized a little bit different from today's presentation. My comment can be, how can I say, a little bit out of date. However, let me try my best. Well, on the version of manuscript I received, according to the version of manuscript I received, Jessica and Christopher tried to connect three factors: state building and economic development and railroad. So because of imperial forces, Siam's government tried to build a railroad to, how can I say, secure their sovereignty. However, this has a kind of side effect, which was economic development. That's the version I received. So under the, well, it is a good thing. What I'm trying to say is this kind of a logic was not so persuasive to some extent, because yes, exogenous forces made Siam's government to build the railroad. It may help ensure sovereignty, and then it also contributes to economic development. However, the relation between ensure sovereignty and local economic development, this relationship is not well mixed, well connected in the previous version of this paper. So the focus of my comment today was that it should be changed. And to some extent, I realized that Jessica and Christopher changed the line of argument. So the weakness of this part was removed according to my understanding. That is a good thing. So I don't want to continue too much on how well, to some extent, criticize this problem and enhance this problem. That is none of my business anymore. However, still, well, although this problem was removed, my feeling of today's presentation is that still line of argument is not so clearly arranged in the sense that Jessica and Christopher try to focus on the relation between railroad construction and local development. That is a good thing. Well, this is kind of a standard analysis of infrastructure and economic development. So the authors show a very clearly positive relation between railroad construction and local economic development. However, from today's presentation, what makes me confused is why they emphasize the exogenous nature of railroad construction. That is, well, that may be good for econometric purpose. That is, if we want to estimate the impact of local development, impact of railroad on local economic development, then exogenous construction of railroad can be a good thing. However, if you are a really good leader of a country, then they should definitely consider economic benefit first, right? In other words, what I try to say is this. It is a suggestion, but what about if you calculate the loss of Siam's government? That is, if they consider economic benefit first, then the benefit of railroad construction can be 100. However, because they constructed railroad under the consideration of political factors, they could not grasp the whole benefit, and then the grasp remained only 50. So that should be the line of argument you should go, I feel. That is, if you emphasize the exogenous nature of the railroad construction, then the cost of exogenous nature should be emphasized compared to the economic benefit if they have considered economic benefit completely. Of course, in doing so, you may say that, of course, the loss of economic benefit can be compensated or can be paid by the political integrity or maintenance of independence. So that's one way you can improve the line of argument, I think. I'm sorry, because this comment comes from instant impressions, so it may be different from what you are thinking. Anyway, other than that, I also try to be as short as possible because according to my experience of this webinar, there are not much time for audience. So other than that, my comments are rather trivial. For example, in the paper, you didn't show descriptive statistic or summary statistic. It should be provided because it was not there. It is a little bit harder to evaluate the regression result. And then, well, of course, it should be very helpful if we show two-way scatter plots between distance and population density or distance and rice production because, well, the distribution of population density should be uneven. Then I'm a little bit concerned that this kind of unevenness might lead the regression result. So basically, you may want to first show the basic two-way scatter plots, and then even after controlling the other factors, the correlation still exists. That's the standard way we may present our result, right? One question is, in the regression result, maybe it was table 1, I think. I'm curious about the positive correlation of distance to Bangkok. Well, many audience may not remember, but according to the regression of table 1, for example, authors include distance to Bangkok variable, and then it shows very strong positive correlation. Does it mean that the further from Bangkok, the population density is higher? Well, it's because it is just a control variable, but still this kind of factor made me very curious about what's going on in the data. That's one reason why I want to see this kind of basic data before regression. This is another minor points. But in the regression, you use the 3 dependent variable, but in running regression, like in equation 5 of table 1, that is you regress paddy cultivation on distance. But in doing this regression, including population density is somewhat ugly, but it should be an important control variable for the share of a paddy cultivation. So I'm not sure whether including this is better or just forget about it like current version. That's one question I had in mind. Lastly, the placebo test is a little bit confusing. Well, this is also related to whether the construction of railroad was really political, or even if it is political, still they have considered economic factors seriously. For controlling them, Jessica and Christopher tried to do made a lot of efforts. One of them is placebo test. He checked using the planned line information. They checked whether those planned line was show any impact on the dependent variable. However, the planned lines are planned not in the late 19th century, but they were planned in 1941. So I'm not sure whether this consideration, this can be a good placebo test. That's the last thing I want to mention. Well, anyway, this paper is pretty interesting and I enjoyed a lot. I hope that this Jessica and Christopher finalize this paper as they expected. Good luck and thank you.
Thank you so much, Doc. So Christopher, would you like to respond to those comments now?
Sure. Thanks, Do. Very helpful as always. So I think there are lots of really great points. I'm gonna just pick out some of them, and then maybe if I miss out on some of these, then Jessica, who's here with us right now, she can also pick up on them too. In terms of distance to Bangkok being positive and significant, that's actually a good catch. We haven't really considered that and given it a lot of thought. But one thing that could explain it is that we're not looking at the entirety of Thailand. We're looking at north and northeastern provinces. So distance away from the capital doesn't necessarily have to mean that there's less population per se, right? These peripheral, we call it peripheral regions because it used to be outside the reach of Siam's control, but they are also closer to the seat of other mandala polities. So you have other political centers that are on the other side of Siam. So maybe the populations in the peripheral areas, they were populous regions. They just happen to be away from Bangkok. So I think that's one way to explain why there's a positive correlation. In terms of economic benefit and political cost, this is it's a very salient kind of topic that we try to address to a certain extent using market access analysis. So again, the focus here is on not the entire country, because what our primary interest was the ones that were affected by political railways, and this was north and northeastern regions. So in there, in those regions in particular, we find that there were certainly economic benefits, local development as a result of laying the railroads. But if you do the calculation differently, which is the market access for the entire country by looking at railways versus the water management, then that's going to address what you're going to suggest, which is, how did the country fare overall, not just for north and northeastern provinces? We can probably do that analysis too. One thing that I wanted to kind of point out in this paper, which was not really specified in the paper because we felt it was getting a bit too confusing for the reader, is that when you implement the water management system, it's not just market access expansion that you benefit from, but it's also increased networks of irrigation that allows greater productivity of orchard and so forth, right? So there's a second component of development and outcomes that is obtained through water management. Now, having said that, that would have influenced the immediate vicinities of regions that would have benefited from increased irrigation. But those regions are in the central plain closer to Bangkok. So that was the proposed plan, which is the proposed plan would have mainly benefited the regions close to Bangkok in the surrounding areas through increased irrigation networks, increased productivity of orchards nearby, and to a certain extent, expansion of market access too, right? But this increase in productivity through irrigation would not have been relevant at all for the north and northeastern provinces. So the only benefit that north and northeastern provinces would have incurred as a result of this other proposed water management that would have been as costly as the railroads would have been just the market access expansion. And in our case, turns out that market expansion is very, very minimal. So the market access benefit from the railways, at least for these two provinces, are much greater. That's where you see the economic benefit kind of shooting up for these two. But yeah, so to kind of give you like a one short kind of response, if we are probably going to be able to do this at the country level as opposed to the provincial level, and the story would be kind of different, and we would be able to address your concern. That's not currently in the paper, you're right. And then the planned placebo test, I don't know. So this one, I think the proposed railways, you're right, they came later in the period, but they still precede 1947, the outcome variable. So I'm not sure if that necessarily invalidates the railway, the placebo test results, but yeah, I'm not quite sure about that. Jessica, do you have any thoughts on that?
Nothing further than that. Yeah, it does predate, as you said, it does predate the outcome variables that we use. And so it felt like it was fair in terms of this was a government plan, and that never got executed. So. Yeah,
and I do apologize for adding in like extra bits about, other context. So what we try to do in this presentation is to give you a bit more background on where the statecraft in Southeast Asia, specifically the Mandala state system, that is much more of a focus in our other works. But we felt that given that we have enough time, it would be a good idea to introduce that context more fully before delving into the empirical results today. Because this paper is an extension of our previous paper. So the focus, and this is where I think, Duo, you're right. There's a bit of a confusion on where the focus of the paper was, because in the previous round, we really just focused on the railways. But then after a series of rounds of reviewers' comments, it really felt necessary to reintroduce the core argument that we had from our previous publication, employ that to this context, and then provide a different setting specifically in terms of railway. So the contribution for this paper is not so much theoretical because that was already done in our previous publication. The contribution here, I would argue, is a more specific mechanism through which centralization was achieved, namely in the way of railways. So that's one. And then district level data. So introduction of district level outcome variables that Jessica and her RA have painstakingly collected by hand that to our knowledge have not been utilized before. So I think that's probably, and then the market access approach, which I thought was pretty fun, that we haven't really used before. So those three, I think that's the main contribution.
Well, thank you so much, both. We are very happy Jessica is also here speaking to our audience. Yeah, it's great. So now let's tend to take a look at the questions from our audience. We received quite a lot of questions, actually. Let me try to introduce them one by one. The first one, it might be related to what you just discussed, the placebo, right? So from Xiaopeng Ren, why the highway does not have effect on these outcomes? It seems to have a similar economic function as railway, right? So how do you deal with this?
So railways does not enter our equation, at least for the first, like the set of baseline results, right? And even for 1966, this is not to indicate that railways would not have been effective on local development. We do. I'm sorry, not highways. It's just that we do see that the magnitude of the coefficients, the distance to the nearest railway by 1966, the effect, the magnitude of that result does go down, which is to say that there are other competing transportation networks that are probably a lot more efficient. We haven't run our regressions using highway access in our data, but I'd imagine that it's very significant too. Yeah.
Okay. The second one from Yu Sasaki.
Hi, Yu. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Do we have data on where floods occur in the rainy season? If so, can we use this as a source of exogenous variation for railway location or routes? Also, flood locations seem to drive market access values. Yeah.
That's a great comment. I don't know if we have that on floods in Thailand too.
I haven't seen it, especially at the district level. So one of the challenges that we have with this paper, pretty much anything on Thailand, sort of pre-1960s, is that it's really difficult to get anything that's at a subnational level. I'm sure there's probably kind of narratives about flooding that in earlier periods, but weather stations aren't actually sort of at district levels until much later on. In terms of whether we think that the floods actually are predictors of where these railways are, I don't think so. And I always say, look at the Northeast. It was very much so a strategic location for the terminus. And if you look at the route of the railway, it goes up through the mountains, whereas the one that goes up north is kind of following, I mean, it's a much flatter area, the Central Plain. It is a part that gets flooded, but there's really no correlation, I think, between the flooding and the location of the railways themselves, if you look at the routes that we're looking at. So, yeah, and I think is very clear that the terminus of the railway is really strategically motivated. We do kind of argue that fairly carefully in the paper.
And another kind of supporting evidence is when you do the IV straight line approach, it is very closely approximating the actual rail lines. So it seems like the consideration in mind for Siam was not necessarily to circumvent the flooded areas, but to build railways, like direct to connect these to like any kind of pairs of strategic centers, despite perhaps some of the terrain or flood difficulties.
Well, next, Kevin Liu asks about the context of your study. How did the Thailand government raise funding to construct the railway? Did the costs were shared between the central government and the peripheral regions?
Shall I take this one?
Yeah, please.
Okay. The railways were funded in two ways. First was through basically government revenues, which come from taxation. That taxation comes from not just the central part that was under really direct control at the turn of the 20th century, but from taxation of the peripheries as well. And I think we had a slide about what happens during the centralization process. They're actually able to collect more taxes from the peripheral areas, and this is used then to fund this particular expensive project, the railway. There are a couple of foreign loans that are taken out to build the railways, and these are part of treaties that also encompassed giving land to the British, for example. So these foreign loans, they were very careful about taking any foreign loans, and you can see this in how it's reported in the statistical yearbook, for example, about how they're paying back these loans, and they're on top of it, because this is often a way for foreign governments to come into to areas that are of interest to them and colonize them. It's like, oh, they can't take care of their fiscal, they can't take care, they're in debt and everything, so we need to take them over. So the Siamese government's really, really careful about taking out loans. But those are the two ways. It was basically domestic taxation, plus the little bit that they could raise in terms of trade tariffs and so on under the Beijing Treaty, and then also some limited loans to build the railways.
Thanks. So Richard Markov asks, how much industrialization occurred and when? This creates a different kind of demand for transport.
Another good question. And during the time period that we're looking at, most of the industrialization was centered around Bangkok. And so there wasn't industrialization that we can tell that was driving demand for the railways. I have done a little bit of work at the provincial level, trying to look at like the number of manufacturing establishments, and I can't see from the kind of the preliminary analysis that I've done really any relationship between the number of establishments per province or per capita in a province and the presence of the railway. So that doesn't seem to be a driver in this case.
Okay, thank you. So the next question from Professor David Mitch. You briefly mentioned intra-regional versus inter-regional and international impact of railroad. Can you discuss whether for Thailand, the intra-regional impact and the benefits was substantially larger than the inter-regional impact along the lines of Fogel's finding for the US? This because inter-regional water transport is an effective substitute for railroad due to access to rivers.
So maybe Jessica can give you more substantive context, but in terms of working with market access, what we do look at is waterborne transport routes, and some of them would have been utilized for inter-regional trade. So we have distance calculation from the the mouth of the river in Bangkok down to the Malacca Strait and then up through Singapore. So these kind of routes that would have been used for inter-regional trade for export are fully taken into consideration when we calculate the market access. And the reason that we wanted to look at both garden crops and rice is precisely this, which is we don't really have other kind of good measure of saying how do these transport routes influence or impact the inter and intra-regional trade. So we're providing kind of findings for both. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, the next is from Professor Pierre Wander Ang. In the counterfactual situation of implementing the water management plan rather than railway construction, would the cost to the public budget of the construction, operation, and the maintenance have been very different? If water management would have been much more expensive, it would have adverse consequences for budget and economy. Alternatively, if railways were funded with foreign loans, would foreign lenders have agreed to loan for the water management plan? And to summarize, how realistic is the counterfactual?
That's actually a really good question. The counterfactual, I mean, it's kind of a nice counterfactual because it really was in discussion. There's a lot of documentation about this discussion about should we do railways or should we do the water management? And there was a cost comparison that was done, and I'm trying to remember which author has, it's been looked at by a few different authors. And they really do come up that a lot of the investment itself was probably fairly similar between investing in the railway and investing in the water management. And so there was kind of a need to choose between the two. The loans for the railways came because the foreign powers wanted those railways. And so that's one reason why they're able to fund with the foreign loans. And in some ways, these loans were kind of forced upon the Siamese government as well. As much as they didn't want to take those loans, they needed to take them for political reasons. Could they have gotten loans to do the water management project? It's possible. I don't think they were seeking loans for those projects, though, because of this issue of they don't want to be beholden to the foreign powers with this debt. Is it a realistic counterfactual? I think it is. Given the discussion that you see in the historical record about this, and thinking about the fact that what are the maintenance costs, and what are, I mean, it was estimated that they were going to be able to make money off of these canals as well. I have some doubts today that they really could have, given sort of the cultural context at the time. But at least within the discussion, it seems like it is a viable counterfactual.
Okay, thank you. The next question from Xinhao Li is about the long-term impact. Do the political railroads have persistent effects on shaping the contemporary economic geography of Thailand? How important are the effects when compared with the railways constructed later?
So I think the reason that we cut off the time period for railroads by 1941 is because that was the period when we can firmly decide that's a set of railway expansion occurred due to political reasons. So that's the political railways. But then when you start adding on these additional railways post 1941, with World War II and the end of, if you will, the Western imperialism in the area, then they no longer become political railways. So it's, I think that comparison, kind of mixing the subsequent railways with the ones that were built up to 1941 will be somewhat misleading. And collectively, we don't think we can call that political railways anymore, because the incentives for the government to expand the railway subsequent to 1941 was very much economics driven, right? But I would imagine that just like any other kind of results, local development probably would have benefited, would have gone up with the additional expansion of railways. We just don't know if we can call that political railways at that point.
And we do have the result in the paper, sort of this these additional results. I think it was maybe table 2 or table 3, where we showed that exposure to the railway has differential results as well. So if you think about the fact that places that are exposed to railways have more positive local economic development outcomes, then I would say, yes, it has a large impact on the economic geography, regardless of whether they're the political rails or the later more economic rails.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, Professor David also ended another question, but I will leave this for you later, okay? Let's try to finish the remaining questions. Professor Zulkit Pamuk provided 2 questions, 2 points. The first one, do you have evidence to show railroads are only politically motivated as opposed to being politically and economically motivated? Let me finish the second, okay? The second one, can it be the railroads encourage the migration from distant areas to closer areas? If that is the case, overall benefits of railroad would be less than what your regression coefficients suggest. Can you test this point?
So let's start with number 2. I think our results are kind of encouraging in the sense that, yes, you might probably have migration from peripheral areas into Bangkok. If anything, the results are positive and significant. So despite the kind of migration towards the urban center or the capital, the fact that you see this result suggests that we have probably a conservative estimate of positive results. So yeah, I think it's entirely possible that migration is happening. But at the same time, maybe not so. So this is not something we have a firm finding on, because as Duo mentioned, and you found out from a regression that distance away from Bangkok is actually positively correlated to population density. So it seems like the population were kind of spread out in the peripheral regions and the central regions too. So we don't capture migration in our analysis. I'm not sure, Jessica, if we have even a migration status from census, but I'm not sure if that is necessarily driving our results.
Yeah, it's difficult because we're using some of the earliest figures that we have in terms of population. I've since found some other population figures that might be useful, that might be able to give some suggestion of migration, but they're still much later than we don't have anything that's like pre-railway construction. And so that's one of the things that we have to contend with this particular project. And of course, something that has to be contended with a lot of developing economy types of data issues. For the first question about is there evidence that these are both political and economic, there is a reason why we looked specifically at the North and Northeast, because these 2 rail lines were very much so political. There were other rail lines, certainly to the south, which was also political, but there's also an economic basis for that railway. It was started later. There is some discussion about the economic benefits of that, compared to the fact that we were only considering political considerations for the first 2 railways, which were to the north and the north, or I should say to the northeast and the north. So I think the historical narrative is actually fairly clear that the north and northeast are very political, and the other ones may have had political reasons as well, but there also are economic considerations in the planning.
Great, thank you so much. Well, next question from Aswin Chasri Chawla. A brief question on your counterfactual analysis with regards to railways versus irrigation system. If I understand your analysis correctly, The results pick up impressive growth in market access in Chiang Mai, Udon Thani, and Ubon Ratchathani. Based on the map you showed, could this possibly overestimate the impact of railways since those cities were regional hubs and could have grown anyways with greater economic growth caused by irrigation investments? Furthermore, since a key point of your argument is that the railway is political rather than economic, I wonder if it would be possible to analyze what the railway route would have been had economic considerations been central.
So in terms of market access differentials, we are in some way controlling for the existing network, the trade market access network, by comparing between the canal option and the railway option. So yes, they are regional hubs, but whatever makes them regional hubs based on existing transportation network is actually differenced out when we do the difference in the market access. So I think we control for that. So I don't think we're overestimating the impact of railways. Oh, and then the second part about the key argument about the political versus economic consideration, I think we already kind of answered that question, but Jessica already answered it, so.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I think we could do the analysis. We haven't, so it would require, it actually requires a lot more data work, but we could do it, but the current version doesn't have that. So
yeah,
we'll consider
it's difficult to label political railway as political, other than just reading through the historical archives and conversations that actually materialize between the state officials and the king. So our our assumption of labeling certain railways as political are really kind of driven by these documents of course, right? Records of people talking about these railways and surrounding like geographical factors too. But you're right, there's always room for whether it could truly economic or truly political, and this is something of a subjective decision that we did make.
Well, great. So finally, the last question from Ross Connor. Was there any significant cottage industries on or near the railroads that might benefit from their construction?
I'm sorry, what's cottage industry?
kind of like small industries.
Oh, okay, got it.
Yeah,
Is
I
that
can take
the-
this one.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, this would be something I would love to take a look at, especially with the whole literature on deindustrialization because of the railways. And there's, of course, at least sort of just from a lot of the economic history work that's been done in Thailand, there is an argument that the railways were detrimental to local cottage industries because cheap imports. It's the same argument that we always see. Cheap imports come and they flood the market, and so the handloom weaving industry is displaced by these cheap imports. There's been some wonderful recent work in Indonesia that says, it may be that's not completely the case. It's much more complicated than that. And I have a feeling in the Thai case, it's probably the same. I have not run into, unfortunately, data that would allow for this type of inquiry. And it's something that would be on my love to-do list, but I'm still waiting for that amazing data drop to happen. And I haven't found this data yet.
I mean, the problem is compounded by the fact that these informal industries, I mean, just there's no data for it, right? It's difficult to.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't get, because it's not like an export. If it's something that's
Right.
exported, it gets captured in the official statistics. If
Right.
it's not exported, then it's not captured. This is why it was nice, at least for some of the rail statistics, we could actually see, garden vegetables, for example. That's something that doesn't get captured normally by trade statistics, but we can see it in the rail data. the census data in 1947 is particularly rich. I may go back and take a look at that. There may be something I can use. I mean, the volumes are like several volumes of thousands of pages, and so I haven't been through all of it, but there may be something that could be looked at, but I think usually those types of statistics are more at the provincial level rather than the district level. I pulled as much as I could in terms of district level data, but it would be worth going back and checking. It was one of the main questions that initially we wanted to look at, and we were having difficulty finding data for it.
Chicha, I think we have like 3 minutes. Maybe we can answer David's question. I know he has a second question about the British India.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so in the case of colonial India, it's been a long time since I read the paper, and I'm not really sure if the argument was expansion of railways due to military considerations or not. But the key angle that we're bringing onto the literature is this idea of internal reform that's brought on by the local ruler under the threat, right? Invasion threat. So substantively, it's very different, right? Because the British, they would have built the rail lines for themselves. This is a colonizers actively taking part in building infrastructure inside the colony. Thailand was not like that at all, right? Because it's the King Chulalongkorn local ruler building infrastructure in defense of encroachment by Western powers. So I think substantively, these are two very different contexts.
Okay, great. So this is the first time we answered all the questions from the That's great. That's great. Yeah. So in the end, let's give Professor Zhu Chen a chance to talk.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Chicha. Yeah. Welcome to the webinar, Jessica. Thank you for joining us. I just want to make a very quick comment. I guess Ross Connor and several others were more or less asking about the channel, the mechanism. The railroad effect was actually working. In some of my own work, we use distance to explain something, and then we have been bombarded with questions. What does that distance really capture or proxy for? So I guess maybe if you can get data, you can also look at the employment structure, or what kind of jobs people were now have as opposed to what they had as a result of the railroad or the proximity to the rail line. So I assume that, whether we're talking about the cottage industry and other things that can be captured. One other, there are many other things, I guess, that you can look at. One of the things is like the marriage patterns, or who the locals marry with, as a result of this railway. I assume, just like in China, with much better transportation networks, the average distance between the wife and the husband for many locals suddenly got a big jump. But I don't know whether you can actually get data on this, but it would be great to examine this sort of social aspect of the railway project. Yeah, thank you.
That's a great idea. I mean, we kind of uncover one particular channel because the main driver is railway, and the one immediate thing that pops out when we think of railway is transport of goods, and we're able to capture that through market access. But as Chef Ken mentioned as well about human migration, and as you mentioned, that could lead into marriages and bringing up the wealth from one part to another through settlement of different families. That's something that we haven't talked about. But thank you. No, that's actually a great suggestion. We kind of we haven't thought about it. But yeah.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Christopher and Jessica, for sharing with us such an important study. And of course, thank you so much, Professor Dawkins, for your discussion, and thank all the participants. Okay. So on March 23, we will have Professor Yoga Baton to introduce his very new study on the ancient history about state capacity and welfare. Okay, we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.